Welcome to today's deep dive. We are really excited you're here with us. We're going to be exploring the architecture of global public health today.
Right, the invisible structures.
Exactly. The epidemiological frameworks, the specific tools that bridge this massive gap between just basic human survival and, actual human flourishing.
It's a huge topic.
It is. And if you are listening to this, if you're a medical student, maybe a junior doctor, a public health trainee, or just a practicing clinician trying to make sense of the systems operating way above your individual patients, you are in exactly the right place.
Absolutely.
Our journey today is going to serve as a companion to your studies, and we're focusing on two really foundational pillars today. We've got population screening, which is our early warning radar, and then the incredibly complex web of food and nutrition.
Sustenance and surplus.
Yeah, sustenance and surplus. And the mission here is we are going way beyond rote memorization. We want to build really clear conceptual frameworks for you. We're emphasizing pattern recognition, and we're integrating epidemiology with high-level policy.
I think it's really essential to just establish the stakes right from the beginning here, because the mindset that you need for this, it's fundamentally different from what you practice on the ward.
Totally different.
Right. When you're in the clinic, you're practicing clinical medicine. You are diagnosing and treating the individual sitting right in front of you. But public health demands population-level thinking. We are looking at the health of millions simultaneously.
Millions of people.
Millions. So today, we are unpacking the mechanics of how we detect unseen hazards before they strike, and how we fuel our populations, navigating the extremes of both scarcity and excess.
And crucially, we're going to interrogate the structural reasoning behind these interventions, because we need to understand the mechanics of what happens when our massive, well-intentioned systems inadvertently generate harm.
Yeah, that's the scary part, because at a population level, if you have a minor statistical miscalculation or, say, a poorly designed policy, it doesn't just fail one patient. It can negatively impact thousands of lives.
And divert millions in critical healthcare funding.
Exactly. It diverts resources that could have saved lives elsewhere.
Okay, let's unpack this. I think the most intuitive place to begin is with the concept of the early warning radar. We all want to catch diseases early, obviously.
Yeah.
But in medical training, the term screening it's thrown around so loosely that it completely loses its clinical meaning.
It really does.
I hear colleagues use it to describe everything from a routine blood pressure check to, like, an infectious outbreak investigation. So let's build our first conceptual framework for you today by strictly defining what population screening actually is, and maybe more importantly, what it isn't.
The erosion of that definition is a massive problem in clinical communication. To build a solid foundation for you, we really need to look back to the classical framework. This was established by Thomas McEwen back in 1968, and it was later refined by bodies like the UK National Screening Committee.
UKNSC, right?
Right. And McEwen defined screening as a medical investigation that does not arise from a patient's request for advice for a specific complaint.
That's the key right there.
It is. The modern public health definition builds on this. It's a proactive service where members of a defined asymptomatic population are systematically invited to undergo a test.
Systematically invited.
Yes. And the explicit goal is to identify individuals who are more likely to be helped than harmed by further diagnostic tests or treatments.
I want to pause on that phrase you used. Does not arise from a patient's request.
Yeah.
Because that represents a total inversion of the standard medical model you're taught in med school.
A complete inversion, yeah.
In standard practice, the patient initiates the encounter because they are suffering. They have a symptom, maybe a persistent cough or a palpable mass, and they come to the physician seeking relief.
Right.
And by seeking that relief, they are implicitly accepting a certain level of risk associated with the diagnostic workup or the treatment. They know there are side effects, but they want to be cured.
That inversion is the absolute cornerstone of the entire enterprise. In true population screening, the individual is sitting at home,
minding their own business.
Exactly. They feel perfectly healthy, they are experiencing absolutely no symptoms, and they have no perceived need for medical care whatsoever. It is the healthcare system that reaches out to them, effectively knocking on their door and asking them to subject themselves to a medical intervention.
Which creates a profoundly different psychological and professional contract between the doctor and the patient.
It does.
If I prescribe a strong medication to someone with a debilitating illness and they experience a side effect, it's an unfortunate but understood risk of trying to cure their suffering.
Right, it's a trade-off.
But if I invite a totally healthy person into my clinic for a screening test, and that test leads to this cascade of invasive diagnostics that causes them physical or psychological harm, the breach of trust is absolute.
Because you disrupted their healthy life under the premise of helping them.
Exactly.
Precisely. The implicit promise of a screening program is, we're doing this because it will benefit you. If the system fails to deliver on that promise, it's a structural failure. And this is exactly why we must rigidly differentiate true population screening from other forms of testing.
So let's look at case finding or opportunistic testing, because people get this confused all the time.
They do. So if a junior doctor is running a diabetes clinic and they systematically check the retinas of their diabetic patients for neuropathy, that is not population screening.
Even though they are screening for a complication.
Right. The wording is tricky, but epidemiologically, it's not screening. Those individuals are already patients. They already have a diagnosed pathology that places them in a high-risk category for a specific complication. The doctor is managing an existing condition, not surveying the healthy public.
Okay, that makes sense. Another area where the terminology blurs for people is surveillance.
Yes.
So, if an infectious disease unit is swabbing an entire community to find the source of an E. coli outbreak, they're looking for asymptomatic carriers. But that still isn't screening the classical public health sense, is it?
No, it isn't. That is outbreak investigation or epidemiological surveillance.
Got it.
The goal there is immediate threat containment to protect the broader public. Often that's done regardless of the direct clinical benefit to the individual being swabbed. True population screening is an ongoing, systematic program targeting a defined demographic.
Like a national call-recall system for cervical cancer.
Exactly. Where every woman between the ages of 25 and 64 receives a scheduled invitation. The primary objective there is the long-term clinical benefit of the individual being tested.
Because we are dealing with healthy populations on such a massive scale, the barrier to entry for establishing a screening program has to be incredibly high. We can't just roll out a test because a new biomarker was discovered in the university lab.
No, absolutely not.
There has to be a rigorous gauntlet that a proposed program must survive. And this leads us to the historical bedrock of screening policy, which is the Wilson and Youngner criteria.
To really appreciate the weight of the Wilson and Youngner framework, you have to understand the era in which it was forged. Following the Second World War, the development of mass miniature radiography allowed governments to screen vast populations for tuberculosis.
Mass chest x-rays.
Right. And once effective antimicrobial therapies for TB became widely available in the late 1940s and 50s, these mass radiography campaigns were seen as monumental triumphs of public health.
They saved countless lives.
They did, but this success bred a kind of unbridled technological optimism. By the 1960s, particularly in the United States, there was an aggressive push to deploy mass screening for a whole host of chronic, non-communicable diseases.
The assumption being, if it worked for a highly infectious pathogen like TB, it should work for everything. Just screen everyone for everything all the time and we'll eradicate disease.
That was the prevailing enthusiasm. Just test everyone. However, astute epidemiologists and public health officials began to recognize the mounting collateral damage of this reckless approach.
The false positives.
The false positives, the psychological distress, the financial strain on primary care networks. It became really clear that intervening in the lives of the healthy was fraught with unintended consequences.
So they had to pump the brakes.
Exactly. In response, James Maxwell Glover Wilson, a medical officer in the UK Ministry of Health, and Gunnar Jingner, a clinical chemist from Sweden, were commissioned by the World Health Organization. And in 1968, they published a landmark monograph. It established the definitive criteria a condition must meet before screening can be justified.
Let's methodically map out that pathway for you, moving from the nature of the hazard to the mechanics of the intervention itself. The first criterion is that the condition sought must be an important health problem. That seems obvious on its face, but it implies a threshold of severity and prevalence. We do not build multi-million-dollar national infrastructures to screen for minor self-limiting ailments.
It dictates resource allocation. The condition must exert a significant burden of morbidity or mortality on the population to justify the expenditure of public funds, and, frankly, to justify the inevitable harms of the screening process itself.
The second criterion requires that the natural history of the condition, including its development from latent to declared disease, is adequately understood. This is really about establishing a window of opportunity.
Correct. The pathology must have a recognizable early symptomatic or latent stage. Consider a disease that progresses from initial cellular mutation to catastrophic systemic failure in a matter of days.
Like an aggressive acute leukemia or something.
Yes, screening for such a condition is futile because the window for early detection is just too narrow. Conversely, if a disease lingers in a latent phase for a decade before becoming symptomatic, you have a massive window during which a screening test can theoretically alter the clinical trajectory.
Which brings us to the intervention itself. There must be a suitable test or examination. It needs to be simple, safe, precise, and validated. But the Wilson and Jungner criteria add a really vital caveat here.
The acceptability caveat.
Yes, the test must be acceptable to the population. I can imagine scenarios where a diagnostic tool is scientifically perfect, boasting incredible accuracy, but it requires a highly invasive or socially taboo procedure. In a healthy population, compliance would be near zero.
Acceptability is a massive vulnerability in program design. If the target demographic refuses to participate due to discomfort, cultural stigma, or logistical inconvenience, the program fails, regardless of its scientific merit.
The science doesn't matter if nobody shows up.
Exactly. Furthermore, there must be agreed-upon policy on whom to treat as patients. This involves establishing precise cutoff levels for the test. Biology rarely deals in binary absolutes.
It's all on a spectrum.
Disease markers often exist on a continuum. Policymakers must decide where on that bell curve a result shifts from normal variation to clinical pathology requiring intervention.
And that intervention has to actually work. This is perhaps the most crucial clinical hurdle. There must be an accepted, effective treatment for patients with recognized disease.
Yes.
Moreover, there must be robust evidence that early intervention, initiated during the asymptomatic phase, yields significantly better outcomes than waiting for the disease to present clinically.
This is a point that junior doctors often wrestle with. Detecting an incurable, aggressively terminal illness 3 years earlier than it would have presented naturally does not equate to a public health victory.
Because you can't change the outcome.
Right. If you have no disease-modifying therapy to offer, early detection simply means you have increased the duration of the patient's psychological suffering. You've given them more time to live as a dying patient without extending their actual lifespan.
That's a really sobering thought. Finally, the program must be economically sustainable. The cost of case finding, including diagnosis and treatment of patients diagnosed, needs to be economically balanced in relation to possible expenditure on medical care as a whole.
You cannot paralyze the entire primary care infrastructure or bankrupt a regional health authority simply to sustain one screening initiative.
Right. Every intervention has an opportunity cost. $1 directed toward a novel screening program is $1 diverted from acute care, from vaccination programs, or from maternal health services.
The Wilson and Jungner criteria force policymakers to view the intervention not in isolation, but within the holistic ecosystem of the health service.
Let's dive deeper into the mechanics of the test itself, because this is where human intuition often fails spectacularly. We need to dissect the mathematical properties of our early warning radar.
The math is where it gets real.
I want to build a clear differentiation for you between the intrinsic properties of a test sensitivity and specificity, and how those properties behave in the messy reality of clinical practice.
It is a critical distinction. Clinicians often conflate the two. Let's define the intrinsic properties first. Sensitivity is the proportion of true positives that are correctly identified by the test. If 100 people in a room actually have the disease, and your test correctly identifies 95 of them, your test has a sensitivity of 95%. It is a measure of the test's ability to cast a wide net and not let any true cases slip through.
But a net with tiny holes catches a lot of debris along with the fish, which is exactly why we need specificity.
Specificity is the proportion of true negatives that are correctly identified. If you have 100 perfectly healthy people and your test correctly identifies 95 of them as healthy, it has a specificity of 95%.
Crucially, this means that 5 out of those 100 healthy individuals will receive a false positive result.
Exactly. In the context of treating an acutely ill patient in the emergency department, doctors prioritize sensitivity. They want to ensure they don't miss a life-threatening diagnosis.
Rule out the worst-case scenario.
Right. But in population screening, where you are testing hundreds of thousands of healthy individuals, specificity becomes paramount.
To illustrate why specificity and prevalence rule the screening landscape, let's look at a concrete clinical scenario. Let's say we are screening for beta thalassemia carrier status.
Good example.
We use a hematological marker called mean cell hemoglobin. The data shows that if we set the cutoff point at 27 picograms, the test achieves 100% sensitivity.
100%.
It is a perfect net. It misses absolutely no one who is a carrier.
100% sensitivity is a remarkable intrinsic property. But what happens when we actually deploy that test?
This is where we run headfirst into Bayes' theorem and the concept of positive predictive value, or PPV.
Right.
If we deploy this highly sensitive test in a demographic with a very high prevalence of beta thalassemia, say specific populations in certain London boroughs, the positive predictive value might sit around 77%.
Which means if a patient's test comes back positive, there's a 77% probability that they are, in fact, a carrier.
Exactly. And from a clinical perspective, a 77% PPV is generally manageable. You can counsel a patient based on that.
But I want you to consider the exact same test, utilizing the exact same 100% sensitivity deployed in a region where the disease is incredibly rare.
The drop-off is catastrophic. In a low-prevalence area, the positive predictive value of that identical test plummets to roughly 1.3%.
1.3%.
I really want you to internalize that number. A test with a 100% sensitivity can yield a scenario where a positive result means there is only a 113% chance the patient actually has the condition.
This phenomenon frequently blindsides junior doctors because human cognitive processing struggles with base rate neglect.
We just look at the test result.
We tend to focus entirely on the new, highly salient piece of information, the positive test result, and we completely ignore the background probability or the prevalence of the disease in the population.
But mathematically, if a condition is exceedingly rare, even a tiny false positive rate will generate an absolute number of false positives that massively dwarfs the number of true positives.
Let's visualize the clinical fallout of that 1.3% PPV. Imagine you are the junior doctor running the follow-up clinic for this screening program. For every one genuine carrier you identify and counsel, you are calling in roughly 75 perfectly healthy people.
75 false alarms.
75. You are looking them in the eye and telling them a screening test indicates they might carry a genetic blood disorder. You subject them to further venipuncture, specialized hemoglobin electrophoresis, and weeks of agonizing waiting.
You induce massive psychological distress in 75 families, all to find one true case.
And that is why prevalence dictates predictive value. You cannot evaluate a screening tool based solely on its laboratory sensitivity. You must evaluate how it interacts with the epidemiological reality of the population you are targeting.
If the prevalence is low and your specificity is not near absolute perfection, your screening program will simply become an industrialized false positive factory.
An industrialized false positive factory, that's exactly what it is. It will destroy staff morale, erode public trust in the healthcare system, and completely overwhelm your diagnostic infrastructure.
This brings us to a darker dimension of our public health architecture. We tend to frame screening as an inherent, unmitigated good. Catching things early is always better, right?
That's the narrative.
But when we look at the systemic impact, we uncover a pattern of unintended harms. I want to unpack the insidious biases that plague screening data, specifically lead time bias and length time bias.
These are crucial.
These statistical illusions can make a failing program look wildly successful. Let's start by dissecting lead time bias.
Lead time bias is a phenomenon that artificially inflates survival statistics without actually extending a patient's life. To understand it, we really need to visualize the timeline of a lethal, untreatable disease.
Okay, walk us through it.
Imagine a patient who develops an aggressive cellular mutation. This is the biological onset. For years, the disease grows silently. Eventually, symptoms emerge, the patient seeks medical attention, and a clinical diagnosis is made. Let's say, from the exact point of that clinical diagnosis, the patient survives for exactly 2 years before succumbing to the disease.
So the standard clinical metric is a 2-year survival time post-diagnosis.
Correct. Now, imagine we introduce a screening program. We test that same patient during the silent asymptomatic phase. We detect the tumor 3 years before symptoms would have appeared.
We found it early.
We did. We initiate our treatments, but because this specific pathology is inherently resistant to therapy, the disease progression is not halted.
Oh, I see.
The patient still dies at the exact same chronological age on the exact same date as they would have without the screening.
So the biological finish line hasn't moved an inch?
Exactly. But look at what happens to the statistics. In the unscreened scenario, the survival time from diagnosis was 2 years. In the screened scenario, we moved the point of diagnosis 3 years earlier.
Therefore, the data now shows a 5-year survival time post-diagnosis.
Yes. The screening program will publish reports boasting a massive increase in survival rates. They'll claim they have revolutionized the management of the disease because survival went from 2 years to 5 years.
But they haven't altered the mortality curve at all. They just started the stopwatch earlier. The patient didn't gain 3 years of life. They gained 3 extra years of living with the agonizing knowledge that they possessed a terminal illness.
The system generated a massive psychological burden and claimed it as a victory. That is the essence of lead time bias. It is a statistical mirage.
To truly evaluate a screening program, you cannot rely solely on survival times from diagnosis. You must look at age-specific mortality rates across the entire population to see if fewer people are actually dying of the disease.
Precisely. Which leads us to an even more complex illusion: length time bias.
This touches on the fundamental biology of how different pathologies behave, because not all tumors are created equal.
They are not. Tumors exhibit immense heterogeneity in their growth rates. Some are highly aggressive, proliferating rapidly and metastasizing early. In epidemiological shorthand, we can think of these as rabbits.
Rabbits, they move fast and are highly lethal.
Fast and lethal. Other tumors are incredibly indolent. They grow so slowly over decades that they may never actually cause clinical symptoms or threaten the life of the host before the patient dies of an entirely unrelated cause, like cardiovascular disease or just old age.
And we can think of these as turtles.
Turtles, yes. So we have a population harboring a mix of rabbits and turtles.
How does the structure of a screening program interact with that biology?
A screening program operates by taking periodic snapshots of the population, say, every 3 or 5 years. Because the rabbit cancers grow so violently and rapidly, they frequently emerge, cause symptoms, and become clinically apparent in the intervals between the scheduled screening rounds.
We call these interval cancers.
Yes. The screening snapshot misses them because their asymptomatic window is so narrow. You test them in January, they're clear, and by November, they have symptomatic disease. The program misses the rabbits.
But the turtle cancers are just sitting there, growing millimeter by millimeter over decades.
Precisely. Because the turtles exist in the detectable asymptomatic pool for a vastly longer duration, any periodic screening snapshot is mathematically overwhelmingly more likely to detect them.
Therefore, a screening program disproportionately identifies slow-growing, benign, or non-lethal variants of the disease.
Yes, and the tragic irony is that at the moment of biopsy, the pathologist often cannot definitively tell the clinician whether this specific cluster of cells is a rabbit or a turtle.
That is the absolute crux of the problem. Faced with a positive biopsy, the clinical imperative is to act. You can't just ignore it.
The system treats the turtle as if it were a rabbit. The patient is subjected to aggressive surgical resection, heavy radiation, or systemic chemotherapy. They endure the severe morbidities associated with these treatments.
They survive, and both the doctor and the patient genuinely believe that a life was saved.
But in reality, that specific indolent tumor was never going to shorten their life. The intervention was entirely unnecessary. This is the definition of overdiagnosis leading to overtreatment.
We see this deeply entrenched in several modern screening paradigms. Consider the ongoing, often contentious debate surrounding breast cancer screening via mammography.
It's a prime example.
While tightly controlled randomized trials have demonstrated a reduction in breast cancer mortality, the real-world application reveals profound challenges with length time bias. Screening frequently detects ductal carcinoma in situ, or DCIS.
DCIS is essentially abnormal cells contained within the milk ducts that haven't invaded surrounding tissue.
Yes, and while some DCIS will progress to invasive, life-threatening carcinoma, a significant proportion will remain entirely indolent.
Yet because we cannot reliably predict which will progress, thousands of women with indolent DCIS undergo lumpectomies, mastectomies, and radiation therapy.
The systemic harm of overtreating these non-progressive lesions is substantial. Prostate cancer screening presents perhaps an even more stark illustration of this.
It does.
We utilize the PSA test, prostate-specific antigen. The epidemiological reality is that prostate cancer is ubiquitous in aging men. As the clinical adage notes, far more men die with prostate cancer than of it.
The PSA test is highly effective at finding the turtles. It detects vast numbers of indolent, microscopic prostate cancers in men in their 70s and 80s. The subsequent interventions, radical prostatectomies, or pelvic radiation carry severe, life-altering risks of urinary incontinence and erectile dysfunction.
We systematically destroy the quality of life for thousands of men to treat a disease variant that was highly unlikely to impact their natural lifespan.
This overwhelming burden of overdiagnosis is exactly why prominent health authorities, including the UK NSC, consistently advise against universal unselected population screening for prostate cancer.
This brings us to a deeply counterintuitive phenomenon. If a screening program is causing massive overdiagnosis, subjecting healthy people to unnecessary surgeries and horrible side effects, you would assume the public would rebel against it.
You would think so.
But the exact opposite happens. This is known as the popularity paradox.
The popularity paradox. It was articulated brilliantly by researchers Raffel and Gray, and it is a masterclass in human psychology intersecting with health policy.
It posits that the more harm a screening program causes through overdiagnosis, the more politically popular and entrenched that program becomes. I want to trace the mechanism there. How does causing harm generate political support?
It centers on the perception of the survivor. When a patient is overdiagnosed with an indolent turtle cancer, they are terrified. They are told they have a malignancy. They undergo the grueling gauntlet of surgery and recovery.
Right.
When they are finally given the all clear, they experience profound gratitude. They genuinely believe the screening program saved their life.
Of course they do. Who wouldn't?
They do not know, and frankly cannot know, that their specific tumor was never a lethal threat.
So the system is essentially manufactured a survivor.
Exactly. And these manufactured survivors become the most passionate vocal advocates imaginable. They form highly organized lobbying groups. They share deeply moving emotional testimonies with politicians and the media, demanding that the screening program be protected and expanded.
They argue, this test saved my life. It is a moral outrage to deny it to others.
Meanwhile, the epidemiologists are looking at the massive population-level data sets, seeing no reduction in overall mortality, and realizing the program is just an engine of unnecessary morbidity.
But trying to explain length time bias and base rate statistics to a politician who is looking at a tearful survivor is an impossible battle.
It creates an almost insurmountable political hurdle. It is incredibly easy for a government to initiate a screening program. It signals that they are proactive and tough on disease. But withdrawing a program, once the advocacy groups are entrenched, is viewed as political suicide.
Which brings us to a chilling historical case study that perfectly encapsulates everything we've just discussed. The Japanese child neuroblastoma screening program. Walk us through the mechanics of how this unfolded.
This is a profound cautionary tale in global public health. In 1985, Japan initiated a nationwide program to screen infants for neuroblastoma, which is a cancer of the sympathetic nervous system.
Okay.
The test measured elevated levels of catecholamine metabolites, specifically VMA and HVA, in the urine of 6-month-old infants. The biochemical rationale seemed sound, and the uptake was massive. Within a few years, the incidence of diagnosed neuroblastoma in infants skyrocketed.
From a superficial perspective, the radar was working perfectly. They were finding the hidden hazard.
They were finding hundreds of cases. These infants were subsequently subjected to major abdominal or thoracic surgeries and often highly toxic chemotherapy regimens. The surgical complications in 6-month-old infants were severe.
Naturally.
However, by 1990, independent international panels began reviewing the epidemiological data, and they made a horrifying discovery. While the incidence of infant neuroblastoma had spiked, the overall mortality rate from neuroblastoma in older children had not changed at all.
The ultimate outcome metric didn't budge. So what were they actually finding in those 6-month-olds?
They were finding indolent, spontaneously regressing tumors. Neuroblastoma possesses a unique biological quirk. Certain infantile variants undergo spontaneous necrosis and completely disappear without any medical intervention.
They cure themselves.
Yes. The screening program was detecting these transient masses before they could naturally resolve. The system was systematically subjecting healthy infants to life-threatening surgeries for a condition that would have cured itself. It was the purest manifestation of length-time bias and overdiagnosis.
Once that data was clear in 1990, the decision to halt the program should have been immediate. But it wasn't, was it?
No. Despite the overwhelming evidence of harm, it took until 2004, nearly 20 years after its inception, as 14 years after the international warnings for the Japanese government to finally suspend the program.
How does a system continue to operate for over a decade when it is actively harming infants?
Because dismantling the architecture of a national program requires monumental effort. It required a highly rigorous, politically insulated national committee to painstakingly review the data.
And they had to overcome the politics.
Crucially, the program was only able to be stopped because it lacked the intense, entrenched patient advocacy groups that characterize adult cancers. Parental knowledge of neuroblastoma was relatively low, preventing the formation of a massive survivor lobby that would have utilized the popularity paradox to keep the program alive.
Had this been a program targeting a highly visible adult disease, it might never have been dismantled. This dark chapter really underscores why rigorous, continuous quality assurance is not just administrative bureaucracy. It is a moral imperative.
Absolutely. When we design these systems, we rely on Donabedian's quality assurance model. Donabedian's framework is essential for assessing any public health architecture.
Structure, process, and outcome.
Yes, it divides evaluation into those three pillars. Structure evaluates the physical and organizational foundation. Do we have the high-resolution imaging machines? Do we have sufficiently trained histopathologists to read the inevitable flood of biopsies? Do we have a robust IT infrastructure?
An IT failure in a screening program isn't just an annoyance, it's a clinical disaster. If the call recall database crashes and a cohort of high-risk individuals misses their invitations, the system has failed its core mandate.
Process evaluates the execution. Are the invitations being dispatched on schedule? What is the interval between a positive screening test and the diagnostic biopsy?
Right, because waiting is terrible.
If a patient waits 3 months in terrified limbo for a biopsy, the process is actively inflicting psychological harm. Finally, outcome is the ultimate arbiter. Are we fundamentally shifting the mortality or severe morbidity curve for this specific disease in the target population?
And tied intrinsically to these outcomes are the massive economic realities. The opportunity costs of screening are astronomical. We are not just talking about the unit cost of a urine dipstick or a blood draw.
The unit cost of the test is often the smallest line item on the budget. The true economic burden is the massive industrial complex required to sustain the program.
Infrastructure.
It involves the salaries of tens of thousands of specialized nurses, the maintenance of dedicated screening clinics, the immense cost of the diagnostic follow-up for the sea of false positives, and the expensive interventions for the overdiagnosed cases.
I want to look at how shifting environmental baselines can totally upend the economic models of a screening program. The text highlights abdominal aortic aneurysm, or AAA. Screening is a prime example of this.
AAA screening targets older men utilizing ultrasound to detect dangerous dilations in the aorta before they rupture. When the foundational cost-effectiveness models for this program were developed decades ago, they were based on epidemiological data from an era with vastly higher smoking rates.
And smoking is a huge factor.
Smoking is a primary driver of vascular degradation and a massive risk factor for AAA. Therefore, in those historical cohorts, the prevalence of AAA was relatively high.
But over the intervening decades, one of the greatest public health victories occurred. Aggressive anti-smoking campaigns dramatically reduced smoking prevalence.
Exactly. As smoking rates plummeted, the actual incidence and prevalence of AAA in the modern population dropped significantly. Now, let's recall our earlier discussion of Bayes' theorem. When the prevalence of a condition in a population drops, what happens to the positive predictive value of the screening test?
The false positives start to overwhelm the true positives. The cost per true case detected skyrockets.
Precisely. The initial economic assumptions became obsolete because the environmental baseline changed. The massive infrastructure built for AAA screening is now searching for a pathology that is becoming increasingly rare.
This demonstrates why public health frameworks cannot be static. They must be continuously recalibrated against the shifting epidemiological realities of the population.
They have to be dynamic.
Let's transition our focus now. We have thoroughly examined the early warning radar. We understand the complex math of predictive values, the profound ethical weight of intervening in healthy populations, and the systemic harms of overdiagnosis. Now, we must turn to the very foundation of population health.
Sustenance.
We are shifting from the microscopic detection of cellular mutations to the macroscopic drivers of human biology. It is time to explore the complex architecture of food and nutrition.
We are entering part 2 of our deep dive, engaging with chapter 2.7. Food and nutrition. If screening is the radar that detects the hazard, nutrition is the fuel that determines whether the structural integrity of the population can withstand the hazard in the first place.
For much of modern medical history, the overarching narrative of global public health was dominated by the battle against infectious disease, deploying vaccines against smallpox, engineering sanitation systems to defeat cholera, distributing bed nets to prevent malaria.
Classical public health.
Right. Those battles remain critical. But there has been a massive paradigm shift. Nutrition in all its complex forms has unequivocally emerged as the primary environmental determinant of global health and disease.
We are witnessing an unprecedented epidemiological transition. Historically, the global landscape was cleanly divided. The developing world struggled with infectious disease and acute caloric undernutrition, famine and starvation.
And the developed world had a different problem.
The industrialized developed world, having secured its food supply, began battling the diseases of affluence: obesity, type 2 diabetes, coronary heart disease, and diet-related cancers.
But the reality today is far more chaotic. We are facing what epidemiologists call the double burden of malnutrition.
The double burden is the simultaneous presence of both undernutrition and overnutrition within the exact same society, the same community, and increasingly within the same household.
How does that even happen?
It's driven by rapid globalization, hyper-urbanization, and the aggressive penetration of multinational food corporations into emerging markets. Countries are transitioning from subsistence agriculture to industrialized food systems at breakneck speed.
So, a junior doctor working in a regional hospital in a rapidly developing nation might spend their morning in the pediatric ward treating a toddler suffering from severe stunting and micronutrient deficiencies.
And then cross the hall to the adult ward to amputate the necrotic toe of a 40-year-old suffering from uncontrolled diet-induced type 2 diabetes.
That is the exact clinical manifestation of the double burden. The health system is stretched to the breaking point, fighting the specters of both the 19th and the 21st centuries simultaneously.
To understand how a population arrives at this breaking point, we need to construct a framework differentiating food security from nutrition security. They are intrinsically linked, but they represent different levels of systemic function.
Let's break down the 4 dimensions of food security first. The most fundamental layer is availability. This is the realm of agriculture, agronomy, and national infrastructure. Does the country physically possess enough calories to feed its citizens?
Are the crop yields sufficient? Are the supply chains and ports functioning to allow for the importation of staple grains?
Availability is the physical presence of the food. But as the Nobel laureate economist Amartya Sen so brilliantly demonstrated in his analysis of historical famines, availability is meaningless without the second dimension, accessibility.
Sen introduced the concept of entitlements. He observed that catastrophic famines often occur not because a region has run out of food. Grain silos might be full, and food might even be exported from the famine zone.
Which seems insane.
It does, but it happens because a specific segment of the population has lost their entitlement to that food.
Their economic purchasing power collapses.
Exactly. If the price of wheat quadruples due to market speculation, or if an agricultural shock destroys the livelihood of day laborers so they have no wages to trade for food, they will starve while staring at a market full of produce. Accessibility transforms food from a physical commodity into an accessible resource.
The third dimension is stability. An agricultural system might provide ample, affordable food for 9 months of the year, but if the supply chain completely collapses during the monsoon season, or if geopolitical conflict cuts off importation routes, that instability fundamentally compromises food security. The system must be resilient to shocks.
And finally, we reach the fourth dimension, which bridges the gap between economics and human biology: utilization. This is where food security evolves into nutrition security.
I find this dimension to be the most clinically relevant. Walk us through the physiological mechanics of utilization.
You can have perfect availability, robust economic accessibility, and year-round stability. A child can consume an adequate number of raw calories every single day.
Wow.
But if that child lives in an environment lacking clean water and basic sanitation infrastructure, their gastrointestinal tract will be constantly assaulted by waterborne pathogens. They will suffer from chronic diarrheal diseases and endemic intestinal parasitic infections.
The food enters the body, but the body's architecture is too damaged to extract the building blocks.
Precisely. The inflamed, damaged mucosal lining of the gut cannot physically absorb the essential amino acids, vitamins, and minerals. The nutrients are literally excreted before they can be utilized.
Plus, the immune system is working overtime.
Right. The constant immune activation required to fight off these endemic infections commands massive amounts of metabolic energy, diverting calories away from growth and neurological development. Nutrition security, therefore, demands not just food, but the holistic integration of public health infrastructure, sanitation, and infectious disease control to ensure physiological bioavailability.
When that utilization fails, or when raw calories are completely absent, we enter the devastating realm of undernutrition. The clinical focus here is intensely directed at the 1,000-day window.
This is critical.
This is the developmental period spanning from a child's conception through to their second birthday. The damage inflicted by malnutrition during this window is profound and brutally often irreversible. The textbook anchors this in the concepts of low birth weight, defined as infants born under 2,500 grams, and intrauterine growth retardation, or IUGR.
When clinicians assess undernutrition in the field, precision in terminology is vital. We utilize specific anthropometric measurements to diagnose the nature and chronicity of the nutritional failure. We must differentiate between stunting, wasting, and underweight. Let's begin with stunting.
Stunting is defined as a significant deficit in height for age. A stunted child is significantly shorter than the standard deviation for their demographic. But it's not just about physical stature, is it? It's a historical record of chronic deprivation.
Stunting is the physical manifestation of a systemic long-term developmental failure. It indicates that over months or years, the child's body did not receive the sustained nutritional inputs required for skeletal and cellular growth. Crucially, stunting is a proxy marker for neurocognitive damage.
That's the tragic part.
A stunted child has a stunted brain. They will struggle to attain developmental milestones, they will have diminished educational attainment, and as adults, their economic productivity will be severely curtailed. It traps entire generations in a cycle of poverty.
In contrast to the chronic nature of stunting, wasting is a marker of acute crisis. Wasting is defined as a severe deficit in weight for height.
Wasting indicates that the body is actively cannibalizing its own fat and muscle tissues to survive an immediate, severe caloric deficit or a massive infectious insult. The child looks emaciated.
This is the presentation we associate with acute famines.
Or populations displaced by active conflict. It is a medical emergency with a high risk of imminent mortality.
And the third metric is underweight, which is a deficit in weight for age. This is essentially a composite indicator. An underweight child might be acutely wasted, chronically stunted, or a tragic combination of both.
Now, we must connect the devastating reality of this early life undernutrition to the adult diseases driving the double burden. We need to explore the Barker hypothesis,
Formerly known as the fetal origins of adult disease.
pioneered by the brilliant epidemiologist David Barker. This is arguably one of the most elegant unifying theories in modern medicine.
This theory completely shifts how we view the timeline of chronic disease. We normally think of a heart attack at age 50 as the result of decades of bad diet and smoking. But the Barker hypothesis suggests the foundation for that heart attack was poured decades earlier, while the patient was still in the womb. How does the intrauterine environment program adult pathology?
To grasp this, you must view the intrauterine environment not just as an incubator, but as an advanced biological information system. The developing fetus is constantly receiving chemical and nutritional signals from the mother.
Okay.
These signals inform the fetus about the nature of the external world it is preparing to enter. If the mother is severely malnourished, the signaling pathway communicates a grim reality. The fetus is about to be born into an environment characterized by severe caloric scarcity and famine.
The fetus is essentially receiving a weather forecast that says a permanent winter is coming. How does it react to that?
It executes a desperate evolutionary survival protocol via complex epigenetic modifications. It alters the expression of its genes to develop what we call a thrifty phenotype.
A thrifty phenotype.
The fetus triages its drastically limited resources. It prioritizes the development of the brain to ensure immediate survival, but it ruthlessly sacrifices the structural development of other critical organs.
This is trying to stay alive.
The beta cells in the pancreas, which produce insulin, are underdeveloped. The nephrons in the kidneys are reduced in number. The elasticity of the cardiovascular system is compromised.
It's building a metabolic engine designed to hoard every single calorie it encounters, while severely limiting its capacity to process surplus energy.
Exactly. It optimizes its biology to survive starvation. Now, what happens if that predictive forecast is wrong?
This is where the tragedy of the modern, rapidly globalizing world unfolds. That child survives infancy, but over the next few decades, their country undergoes massive economic transition. They migrate from an agrarian village to a rapidly expanding urban megacity.
Right.
They leave behind the environment of scarcity and are suddenly immersed in a modern food environment flooded with cheap, highly caloric, ultra-processed fast foods, refined sugars, and industrial seed oils.
The mismatch is biologically catastrophic. You take a metabolism that was intricately engineered in utero to hoard scarce calories, and you drown it in an unrelenting surplus of energy-dense food.
It just can't handle it.
Because the pancreas was stunted during fetal development, it lacks the beta cell capacity to produce enough insulin to handle the massive glycemic load. The individual rapidly develops insulin resistance. Because the metabolism is programmed to store energy at all costs, they rapidly accumulate dangerous visceral adiposity around their organs.
The Barker hypothesis provides the exact biological mechanism explaining why an individual who suffered from intrabone growth retardation is at a massively amplified risk of developing explosive obesity, early-onset type 2 diabetes, severe hypertension, and fetal cardiovascular disease when they reach adulthood.
It inextricably links the two extremes of the double burden. The undernutrition of the mother directly programs the metabolic diseases of affluence in the child. This conceptual framework demands that we view maternal nutritional support not merely as pediatric care, but as the ultimate upstream prevention strategy for adult cardiovascular disease.
It is breathtaking to consider that fortifying the diet of a pregnant woman today could prevent a coronary bypass surgery 40 years in the future. Now let's examine another insidious form of malnutrition. We often picture malnutrition as a total lack of food, but there is a phenomenon called hidden hunger, or micronutrient malnutrition.
Hidden hunger occurs in populations that may be consuming an adequate volume of raw calories, often through a monotonous reliance on a single staple crop, like rice, maize, or cassava, but their diets are critically devoid of essential vitamins and trace minerals required for cellular function.
The global public health architecture focuses primarily on four major deficiencies: iron, iodine, vitamin A, and zinc. Let's systematically break these down, starting with iron.
Iron deficiency is the most prevalent nutritional deficiency on the planet, driving the massive global burden of iron deficiency anemia. The clinical manifestations are severe.
Impaired cellular respiration.
Degraded T lymphocyte function leading to increased susceptibility to infection, and in pregnant women, a drastically elevated risk of maternal hemorrhage and low birth weight infants.
And the macroeconomic impact is equally staggering. Iron is fundamentally required for the hemoglobin molecule to transport oxygen to muscle tissues. In populations with endemic anemia, physical working capacity just collapses.
The cognitive development of children is permanently impaired. The textbook highlights that the aggregate loss of physical productivity and cognitive potential due to iron deficiency can cost a developing nation such as Bangladesh up to 7.9% of its gross domestic product annually.
An entire national economy is hobbled because its workforce's blood cannot carry enough oxygen. So why not just hand out iron pills to everyone? This is where the biochemistry of food utilization becomes incredibly complex.
You have to understand the nuances of bioavailability. Iron exists in diets in two distinct forms. Heme iron, derived from animal tissues like meat and blood, is highly bioavailable. The human gut absorbs it efficiently.
But in many developing regions, animal protein is economically inaccessible.
The population relies on non-heme or inorganic iron derived from plant sources.
And the absorption of non-heme iron is highly volatile. It is intensely dependent on the chemical composition of the rest of the meal.
Precisely. If you consume non-heme iron alongside ascorbic acid, vitamin C, found in citrus or fresh vegetable, the absorption is significantly enhanced. The vitamin literally helps pull the iron across the gut wall.
But there are inhibitors too.
Many staple cereals and legumes are rich in compounds called phytates. Phytates are aggressive inhibitors. They bind to the iron in the digestive tract, rendering it insoluble, and the body simply excretes it.
Therefore, a diet based heavily on unrefined cereals might appear mathematically sufficient in iron content on a nutritional chart, but biologically the population is starving for it.
Furthermore, we must integrate the epidemiological reality of the environment. A junior doctor in a rural clinic can prescribe iron supplements perfectly, but if the local population is suffering from endemic hookworm infections, the intervention will fail.
Because the hookworms physically attach to the intestinal mucosa and consume the host's blood.
You cannot out-supplement a parasitic infection that is actively bleeding the patient internally. Effective public health demands systemic thinking. Nutritional supplementation must be paired with aggressive deworming campaigns and sanitation improvements.
Let's move to iodine, which illustrates the profound impact of geographic determinism on human health. Iodine is essential for the synthesis of thyroid hormones, which regulate metabolic rate and, crucially, fetal brain development.
Iodine deficiency disorders, or IDD, manifest as goiter, the massive compensatory hypertrophy of the thyroid gland in the neck, and cretinism,
which is a devastating condition characterized by profound, irreversible physical and mental retardation in infants born to severely iodine-deficient mothers. But unlike iron, which is found in a wide variety of foods, iodine distribution is dictated by the soil.
Iodine is heavily concentrated in seawater and coastal soils. However, in vast, mountainous inland regions, the Himalayas, the Andes, the Alps' heavy glaciation, and millennia of rainfall have aggressively leached the iodine out of the soil.
Consequently, any crops grown in that soil and any animals grazing on those crops are inherently devoid of iodine. The local population is geographically sentenced to iodine deficiency.
And once again, specific dietary staples can actively sabotage the body's attempt to utilize what little iodine is available. The textbook explicitly details the danger of goitrogens.
This is a fascinating biochemical interaction. Let's talk about cassava. Cassava is a hardy, drought-resistant root vegetable that serves as the primary caloric staple for millions of people across rural Africa and South America.
However, raw cassava contains complex molecules called cyanogenic glucosides. You can visualize these molecules as microscopic chemical Trojan horses. When the human digestive system breaks down the cassava, it opens the horse and releases a compound called thiocyanate into the bloodstream.
And thiocyanate is a chemical bully.
It acts as a competitive inhibitor at the cellular level. It rushes to the thyroid gland and physically blocks the receptors designed to absorb iodine. So, if a population lives in an iodine-depleted mountainous region and they rely heavily on cassava to survive, the thiocyanate actively prevents their thyroids from capturing the trace amounts of iodine present in their environment.
The risk of goiter and cretinism skyrockets. The primary public health intervention for IDD is universally recognized as one of the most cost-effective strategies in history: the iodization of salt. Because salt is consumed by every demographic segment in roughly equal amounts, it is the perfect delivery vehicle.
But in highly remote mountainous regions, maintaining the quality control and distribution networks for iodized salt can be logistically impossible. In those extreme environments, public health officials pivot to a different strategy: iodized oil.
A clinician can administer a single intramuscular injection or a potent oral dose of slow-release iodized oil. That single intervention can provide an individual with sufficient iodine to protect their thyroid function and prevent cretinism for a year or more. It demonstrates the necessity of adapting the intervention to the logistical constraints of the terrain.
Next on our list is vitamin A. Vitamin A deficiency is a leading cause of preventable childhood blindness worldwide. It manifests progressively, beginning with night blindness and advancing to xerophthalmia, where the cornea dries out, ulcerates, and becomes permanently scarred.
Beyond the catastrophic loss of vision, vitamin A plays a critical role in maintaining epithelial integrity and cellular immune function. A child deficient in vitamin A possesses a severely degraded immune system.
They are vastly more susceptible to dying from common childhood infections, such as measles or diarrheal diseases, that a well-nourished child would easily survive.
To combat this, public health has heavily utilized the strategy of targeted food fortification. The goal is to identify a ubiquitous condiment or staple food that is consumed by everyone, particularly the poorest demographics, and artificially inject the missing micronutrient into it at the point of processing.
It is an elegant systemic solution because it does not require the population to consciously change their dietary behavior. The textbook cites successful historical campaigns where public health authorities in Central America successfully fortified commercial sugar with vitamin A. In Indonesia, they utilized monosodium glutamate, or MSG, as the delivery vehicle, drastically reducing the incidence of night blindness.
This discussion of altering the nutritional profile of crops inevitably brings us to one of the most intensely debated tools in the modern agricultural arsenal: biotechnology and biofortification. We are talking about genetically modified, or GM, foods. In examining this, we must remain strictly objective, focusing solely on the mechanisms and the structural arguments presented in the literature.
From a purely biotechnological and nutritional standpoint, genetic modification offers the capacity to directly engineer solutions to hidden hunger into the DNA of staple crops. The archetypal example is golden rice,
which was genetically modified to express high levels of beta-carotene, a precursor to vitamin A, directly in the endosperm of the rice grain.
Furthermore, biotechnology can engineer crops to withstand severe drought, resist specific pests without chemical pesticides, or tolerate high salinity soils, thereby massively increasing agricultural yields and stabilizing food security in increasingly hostile environments.
Those are the purported public health benefits. However, the textbook equally highlights profound structural, ecological, and economic concerns that complicate the widespread adoption of GM crops.
The primary resistance stems from the intersection of biology and corporate economics. The development of transgenic seeds requires massive capital investment, leading to a concentration of agricultural power within a few multinational biotechnology corporations.
Public health advocates raise severe concerns about the monopolization of the global food supply. This anxiety is crystallized by the concept of terminator genes, genetic modifications that render the seeds produced by the harvested crop biologically sterile.
Which fundamentally disrupts the oldest agricultural practice in human history,
Right.
saving seeds. If smallholder farmers in developing nations cannot save seeds from this year's harvest to plant next year, they are trapped in a cycle of dependency. They are forced to purchase new, patented seeds from the multinational corporation every single season, fundamentally undermining the economic accessibility dimension of their food security.
It is a highly complex arena where the promise of nutritional density collides with the realities of corporate hegemony. As developing nations navigate these complexities of undernutrition, they are simultaneously crashing into the second half of the double burden. As populations urbanize and economies industrialize, the primary threat to public health shifts dramatically. We enter the nutrition transition, culminating in the global epidemic of non-communicable diseases, or NCDs.
We are transitioning from the diseases of scarcity to the diseases of affluence. Coronary heart disease, severe hypertension, a multitude of diet-related cancers, and the explosive rise of obesity and type 2 diabetes. The epidemiological evidence linking the modern industrialized diet to these chronic pathologies is monumental and undeniable.
Let's trace the foundational evidence, beginning with coronary heart disease, or CHD. The bedrock of our understanding of diet and heart disease is Ansel Keys' landmark 7-country study.
Keys embarked on a massive, cross-cultural epidemiological undertaking following the Second World War to understand why affluent American men were suddenly dropping dead from heart attacks at unprecedented rates.
Keys rigorously analyzed the diets and the cardiovascular outcomes of cohorts across diverse geographic populations. The correlations he uncovered were staggering. In post-war Japan, the traditional diet was extremely low in animal fat. Saturated fat accounted for a mere 3% of their total energy intake.
Correspondingly, their incidence of coronary heart disease was vanishingly rare.
But when Keys looked at populations in Northern Europe, the picture inverted.
In cohorts in Finland, where the diet was heavily reliant on dairy and meat, saturated fat accounted for roughly 22% of total energy intake, and their rates of devastating cardiovascular events were astronomically high. The 7-country study firmly established a powerful positive population-level relationship between the consumption of dietary saturated fats, which aggressively elevate total and LDL cholesterol levels in the blood, and the incidence of coronary heart disease.
The study also identified protective dietary patterns. Populations consuming high levels of monounsaturated fatty acids, such as the olive oil-rich diets of the Mediterranean, or polyunsaturated fatty acids, such as the marine oils consumed by Inuit populations, demonstrated remarkably lower risks of cardiovascular mortality, despite consuming relatively high total amounts of fat. It wasn't just about total fat, it was about the specific biochemical structure of the lipids. Moving from lipids to minerals, we must examine the epidemiological drivers of hypertension. The foundational data here emerges from the InterSalt study. This was an immense logistical achievement, measuring 24-hour urinary sodium excretion, the most accurate biological marker for dietary salt intake across 52 centers in 32 different countries. Analyzing individual-level data for sodium intake and blood pressure can sometimes be muddy because of immense genetic variance in salt sensitivity. But when the InterSalt researchers zoomed out and looked at the macro population-level data, the trend was undeniable.
When supported by massive meta-analyses of rigorous randomized controlled trials, the physiological reality is clear. High dietary sodium intake aggressively drives blood pressure up. It forces the cardiovascular system to operate under sustained, damaging high pressure. Conversely, high dietary potassium intake, which is found abundantly in fresh fruits, vegetables, and unrefined complex carbohydrates, exerts a protective, vasodilatory effect, driving blood pressure down.
The modern ultra-processed diet is a physiological nightmare. It is heavily loaded with refined sodium for preservation and flavor, while being completely stripped of potassium. This inverted ratio is the primary engine driving the global epidemic of hypertension and subsequent devastating strokes.
The epidemiological links extend deeply into oncology as well. The textbook notes that up to 1/3 of all human cancers could be directly related to dietary components. It isn't just about excessive calories. It is about specific chemical exposures within the food supply.
The mechanisms of diet-induced carcinogenesis are varied. Let's look at aflatoxin. This is a highly toxic mycotoxin produced by fungi that rapidly contaminate improperly stored grains, maize, and peanuts in hot, humid environments. Chronic dietary exposure to aflatoxin is a massive independent driver of primary liver cancer in many developing regions.
We also see clear correlations with macronutrient choices. High dietary salt intake, particularly from preserved or pickled foods, is strongly linked to stomach cancer, as it chronically damages the gastric mucosa. Furthermore, the epidemiological consensus is clear that heavy consumption of red meats and chemically processed meats significantly increases the risk of colorectal cancer.
Conversely, dietary fiber derived from whole grains, legumes, and vegetables acts protectively, accelerating transit times and diluting carcinogens in the gut, thereby decreasing colorectal risk.
And underlying all of these specific NCDs, heart disease, strokes, cancers, is the overarching global explosion of obesity. This is the predictable outcome of the nutrition transition. We have engineered environments that provide ubiquitous, constant access to ultra-processed, hyperpalatable, energy-dense foods.
Simultaneously, the transition from agrarian labor to urbanized, sedentary, screen-based lifestyles has caused a massive collapse in population-level physical activity. The human metabolism, evolved over millennia for scarcity, simply cannot process this chronic energy surplus.
So if the modern food environment is literally killing the population, how does the public health architecture respond? We cannot simply put an entire nation on a specialized diet plan. This brings us to a critical conceptual framework: population nutrient intake goals.
To understand the strategy behind these goals, we must look to the brilliant epidemiologist Jeffrey Rose and his concept of the prevention paradox. How do we measure and manage risk in a society? Biological parameters like blood pressure, cholesterol, or BMI are not binary. They exist on a continuous spectrum, forming a bell curve across the population.
Historically, clinical medicine has focused exclusively on the extreme right tail of that bell curve. The doctor targets the individuals with the absolute highest cholesterol or the most severe hypertension, diagnosing them as high risk and prescribing powerful statins or intensive diet therapies.
While treating high-risk individuals is clinically necessary, Jeffrey Rose mathematically demonstrated that it is an ineffective strategy for improving public health. The paradox is that the vast majority of heart attacks and strokes in a society do not occur in the small handful of individuals at the extreme high-risk tail.
The majority of the disease burden actually emerges from the massive, bulging middle of the bell curve. The millions of people who have only moderate or slightly elevated risk simply because there are vastly more of them.
I want to make sure I grasp this perfectly. So a massive number of people exposed to a small risk generates more total casualties than a tiny number of people exposed to a massive risk. Therefore, the public health imperative isn't just to rescue the few individuals drowning at the extreme end of the curve.
Exactly. The public health imperative is to shift the entire risk distribution curve of the whole population downwards. We must move the entire bell curve to the left. If we can lower the average blood pressure of an entire nation by just a few millimeters of mercury, we will prevent hundreds of thousands more strokes than if we only aggressively treated the few individuals with severe hypertension.
And population nutrient intake goals are the specific quantitative targets designed to force that curve to the left. The World Health Organization sets these targets not for individual diet plans, but to guide national food policy. They dictate that, at a population average, total fat should be restricted to between 15 and 30% of energy. Saturated fats must be driven below 10%. Free added sugars must be restricted to less than 10%. Dietary sodium must be driven below 5 grams per day. And the population average for fruit and vegetable consumption must rise above 400 grams daily.
But achieving these population-wide shifts is a monumental challenge because we are no longer just fighting biological pathogens. We are fighting the commercial determinants of health.
The system is rigged against the individual. You cannot simply hand a patient a pamphlet outlining the intake goals and expect them to overcome the environment. They walk out of the clinic into a world dominated by massive corporate marketing budgets, where cheap, ultra-processed junk food is available on every corner, while fresh produce is expensive and inaccessible in urban food deserts.
Because public health is fundamentally about systems, we cannot rely on individual willpower to solve an environmental crisis. We must engineer the environment to support the healthy choice. This requires aggressive structural interventions. It involves implementing significant taxation on sugar-sweetened beverages to alter consumer economics. It involves strictly regulating or banning the marketing of ultra-processed foods targeting children.
It also involves empowering the consumer with immediate, transparent data at the point of decision. This is the rationale behind the traffic light nutritional labeling systems implemented in several countries. Instead of expecting a tired parent to decipher a complex matrix of grams and percentages on the back of a box, the system forces manufacturers to place highly visible red, amber, or green color codes on the front of the packaging, instantly signaling if the product contains dangerously high levels of saturated fat, sugar, or salt.
These structural policies, taxation, marketing bans, mandated transparency are the tools we use to combat the commercial determinants and slowly drag the population bell curve back toward health.
Which brings us to the culmination of our journey today. We have zoomed all the way in to examine the microscopic equations of sensitivity and specificity in a blood test, and we have zoomed all the way out to analyze how the monopolization of agricultural seed patents impacts the rates of systemic disease in a rapidly developing megacity. What emerges repeatedly is the absolute necessity of rigorous systemic design. Public health is not merely giving dietary advice, nor is it hastily deploying an uncalibrated screening radar because a politician wants to appear proactive.
To synthesize everything we've discussed, consider the classic public health parable. A clinician is standing by a rapidly flowing river. They see a drowning person floating past. The clinician jumps in, struggles against the current, and pulls the patient to safety. It is a clinical triumph. But immediately, another drowning person floats by, then another. The clinician is soon exhausted, desperately pulling bodies from the water, completely overwhelmed by the unending flow of casualties.
They are so consumed by the immediate crisis that they cannot look up.
Clinical medicine treats the person actively drowning in the river, but public health must walk upstream. We must find out who or what is pushing his people into the water in the first place. Whether that upstream hazard is a fundamentally flawed prostate screening protocol that is throwing thousands of healthy men into the agonizing waters of surgical complication and anxiety, or whether it is an impoverished urban food desert interacting with a history of intrauterine growth retardation to push an entire generation into the devastating currents of early-onset type 2 diabetes, our mandate is to design the upstream architecture to stop the fall.
A perfect summary. Okay, it is time for our learning reinforcement segment. We have covered a massive amount of conceptual ground, so let's lock in those key frameworks with a rapid recall quiz. I will ask the single best answer style question, pause for a moment to let you think, and then our expert will provide the answer and the chapter reference. Let's begin now. Question 1. Which precise term describes the systematic, proactive application of a test to an asymptomatic population, as opposed to testing an existing patient who is already seeking medical advice for a symptom? Take a second to think about that.
That is true population screening. This must be strictly differentiated from case finding or opportunistic testing, which occurs within an existing clinical relationship. You can review the ethical and operational boundaries of this concept in Chapter 11.4 under Concepts in Screening.
Question 2. In the context of evaluating an early warning radar, if a specific disease has a very low baseline prevalence in a target population, how does this mathematical reality affect the positive predictive value, or PPV, of even a highly sensitive and specific screening test?
The positive predictive value will be astonishingly low, resulting in an overwhelming absolute number of false positives. Even with 95% specificity, if the disease is rare, the sheer volume of healthy people falsely flagged will dwarf the true cases found. Revisit Chapter 11.4. Properties of screening tests for the detailed breakdown of Bayes' theorem in practice.
Question 3. Shifting our focus to nutrition. When utilizing anthropometric measurements to assess childhood undernutrition, which specific measure indicates stunting, a metric that reflects a chronic, long-term physiological and neurocognitive deficit?
Stunting is defined as a significant deficit in height for age. It is a historical marker of long-term growth restriction, completely distinct from wasting, which is a deficit in weight for height indicating acute starvation. You can find this crucial differentiation in Chapter 2.7, Childhood Undernutrition.
Question 4. What is the core biological mechanism proposed by the Barker hypothesis regarding intrauterine growth retardation?
The Barker hypothesis, or fetal origins of adult disease, posits that severe fetal undernutrition epigenetically programs the infant's metabolism to expect a world of severe scarcity. This thrifty phenotype severely compromises pancreatic and cardiovascular development, massively amplifying the risk of adult diseases like obesity, diabetes, and hypertension when that individual is later exposed to an energy-dense, industrialized environment. Review this mechanism in Chapter 2.7. Low birth weight.
Question 5. Returning to the systemic harms of screening. What specific type of statistical bias occurs when a periodic screening program disproportionately detects slow-growing, indolent benign conditions, the turtles, rather than rapidly progressing aggressive lethal ones.
That is length time bias. Because the slow-growing indolent tumors remain in the detectable asymptomatic pool for a much longer duration, the screening snapshot is mathematically far more likely to detect them, directly leading to systemic overdiagnosis and overtreatment. Revisit Chapter 11.4, Screening in Adults and Cancer.
And finally, question 6. Which incredibly hardy staple crop, heavily relied upon in developing rural populations, contains cyanogenic glucosides that release a goitrogen called thiocyanate, actively exacerbating the risk of goiter and cretinism? Think about that for a second.
Cassava. The thiocyanate released during digestion acts as a competitive inhibitor, physically locking the thyroid gland from absorbing trace environmental iodine, exacerbating iodine deficiency disorders in already depleted regions. Review this biochemical interaction in Chapter 2.7, Iodine Deficiency Disorders.
Excellent work. Before we conclude, we want to leave you with a provocative thought to mull over as you consolidate your learning. Throughout this deep dive, we have treated our screening protocols and our agricultural systems as somewhat distinct entities operating on a stable playing field. But what happens when the very foundation of that playing field shifts beneath our feet? Consider the escalating reality of global climate change. We know that shifting weather patterns and severe droughts directly threaten agricultural stability. This will inevitably worsen global food security, drive up the prices of nutrient-dense foods, and trigger a resurgence in maternal undernutrition and IUGR in vulnerable regions. But simultaneously, a warming, more volatile climate fundamentally alters the geographical spread of vectors like mosquitoes and ticks. It changes the habitats of zoonotic reservoirs. This means the underlying epidemiology and prevalence of infectious diseases will shift dramatically. If a disease that was previously rare in your region suddenly spikes in prevalence due to a shifting climate envelope, the entire mathematical foundation of your screening programs changes. Remember Bayes' theorem. If prevalence spikes, your positive predictive values shift. If prevalence drops because a vector dies out, your false positives explode. The risk profile is completely rewritten. So the critical question for the next generation of public health leaders is this: how agile is our architecture? How quickly can our early warning radars and our agricultural safety nets adapt when the environment itself is a rapidly moving target? Are we building rigid, unyielding systems optimized for an epidemiological world that no longer exists? It requires continuous, systemic recalibration.
It demands an architecture that is not just robust, but inherently adaptive. Because if the environmental baseline shifts, the entire ethical and economic justification for our interventions must shift with it.
Something to think critically about as you review the chapters and prepare for the ward. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Here are the details of this episode.
GPH 12. Food and nutrition.
Yes.
Excellent. We now move from water to sustenance, from survival to sustenance and surplus.